Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here, as always, is to take these really complex, sometimes thorny subjects and just distill the essential knowledge and hopefully some surprising insights for you, the learner.
And today's topic is a big one.
It is. We are diving into what is, I think you could argue, the most persistent and emotionally charged debate in modern Western thought: creation versus evolution.
It's a duality that's just so deeply embedded in our cultural conversation. I mean, whether you grew up in a faith tradition or not, you're familiar with this framing.
Oh, absolutely.
It's often presented as this intellectual battleground. For
hmm
so many people, accepting one seems to mean you have to completely reject the other.
Exactly. It's this duality that's used to enforce a really rigid choice. You're told you either have to align yourself with a strict literal interpretation of scripture, or you have to fully embrace modern science.
And that can be a really painful choice for people who value both their faith and, scientific inquiry.
It really can. And for scientists who also hold the deep faith, I mean, it can be a genuine career-defining stumbling block.
Well, the source material we're looking at today argues that this entire framework, this whole intellectual battle,
Mm.
it's not just unnecessary, it's actually based on a fundamental error.
An error.
We call it a categorical definition error. So
Mhm.
our mission in this deep dive is to unpack that error, really get into it, and propose a more accurate and hopefully more constructive frame for understanding this relationship.
Okay, so before we get into the weeds, let's establish the high-level takeaway right at the top. The single point that if you get it, it just changes the entire conversation.
Do it.
Creation is fundamentally about who made the world,
Right.
whereas evolution is a scientific theory that tries to describe how life changes.
That's it.
We're dealing with two separate spheres that are answering two completely different types of questions, forcing them to compete against each other. It just creates a false choice.
Exactly. And to really understand that false dichotomy, we have to look really closely at the definitions and the inherent categories they belong to.
Yeah.
So when we start with the concept of creation, we're dealing with a statement of theology and philosophy.
Okay, so it's not a scientific statement.
Not at all. It's the belief that a transcendent, intentional God brought the world and all living things into existence.
This sounds simple, but I think it's crucial we slow down right here. What category of question is creation actually answering?
It answers the question of agency,
Right.
the who. It focuses on the ultimate source, the intentionality, the purpose behind why anything exists at all.
So it's about meaning.
It's about meaning. The concept of creation asserts that the universe isn't an accident, it's ordained. And crucially, a statement about agency. It doesn't inherently restrict or define the timeline or the duration or the specific tools that the creator might have used.
Right. Okay, so that's creation. Now let's contrast that with evolution. This is where all the tension seems to come from.
It is. And when we discuss evolution, we are dealing exclusively with a scientific theory. It's a systematic explanation, one that's supported by a huge body of evidence describing observable and testable phenomena
Phenomena about what, specifically?
about the process of life's change, its diversification, and its development over vast periods of time. It is a statement about mechanism or process.
It describes the how.
It describes the how. That's the perfect way to put it.
And this right here, this is the core of that categorical error you mentioned. We're pitting a philosophical, theological statement about who did it, intentional origin, against a scientific observation about how it happened, a natural process.
Exactly. You're trying to make two different languages compete.
So why is that so inherently flawed?
Because scientific theories, just by their very nature, they operate within the realm of the measurable, the physical, the natural world. Evolution, or physics, or chemistry,
Yeah.
they are strictly descriptive of what we can observe.
So they're silent on the question of God.
Completely silent on the question of ultimate agency. A theory of mechanism makes absolutely no assumption about whether a creator exists or not. It just describes the rules of the game as we see them being played.
Okay, so if someone uses evolution to argue against the existence of God, what they're actually doing is stepping outside the scientific definition of the theory itself.
Yes. They're imposing a philosophical position atheism onto a scientific model. They're using the how to try and disprove the who.
And on the flip side, when a believer rejects evolution purely out of fear that it undermines the creator.
They're making a similar category error. They're misunderstanding that the creator could very well have used that exact mechanism. So the debate, you see, it's not really creation versus evolution.
So if that comparison is flawed from the get-go, what is the correct one? What's the right theological and philosophical comparison to make? How do we reset the boundaries of this conversation?
The source material is very, very clear on this. The legitimate debate, the real conversation we should be having, is between creation versus atheistic origin.
Creation versus atheistic origin. Explain that.
The fundamental question we have to ask is this. Did the universe and life come to exist because of an intentional transcendent creator, that's creation, or did it all arise purely through accident, through chance, through randomness, with no guiding intelligence whatsoever? That's atheistic origin.
Wow. That reframing immediately clarifies the stakes. So if you affirm faith, if you're Christian, you must affirm creation. That's the baseline, the belief in the intentional who.
That is the non-negotiable threshold.
Yeah.
And once you accept that, then the acceptance or rejection of a scientific theory like evolution, well, it's no longer a primary theological hurdle.
It becomes a secondary discussion.
Exactly. It falls entirely within the larger framework of creation. So the question shifts from, does evolution contradict God, to a much more interesting question. Could evolution be the method God used?
This is a really powerful shift. I can see how it liberates the believer. It means the debate isn't about whether God created, but about what tools he might have chosen to employ in his workshop.
Indeed. The conclusion here is that every Christian must believe in creation, the ultimate agency. But the debate about evolution moves into the realm of mechanisms. It allows for theological flexibility regarding God's chosen method.
You can't yield the idea of creation itself.
You can't.
Oh.
But you can, and our sources argue you must, hold the debate about the process in a secondary position. This prevents that primary theological truth from being held hostage by disagreements over scientific models.
Okay, so we've successfully separated the who, which is creation, from the how, the mechanism. Now we need to get a lot more specific about that how, and the source material provides this really helpful structure by categorizing the mechanism debate into 3 distinct domains. Why is that necessary? Why can't we just talk about evolution as one giant concept?
That's a great question. It's because evolution has become this kind of catch-all term. It gets used to talk about 3 really separate scientific problems.
It conflates them.
It absolutely does. It conflates the origin of the whole cosmos, the origin of life itself, and then the development of different species. So the sources use this structure to distinguish between that strict, sudden supernatural creation model, the one you associate with a literal 6-day interpretation, and the models that are based on scientific theories.
And by breaking it down, you're saying we can evaluate them individually.
Precisely. You can accept one mechanism without being forced to accept the others. It gives you a lot more precision.
Okay, let's analyze these 3 core domains. We'll move chronologically from the very beginning of existence up to the complexity of life we see today.
Perfect. So the first domain deals with the absolute beginning, the start of the entire universe. Here we're comparing the 2 most common explanatory mechanisms for how the cosmos originated.
Right.
So the first mechanism is that traditional, very literal interpretation, temporary supernatural creation. This is the position that the universe just appears suddenly, formed exactly as described in Genesis, maybe over 6 24-hour periods, or maybe even instantaneously.
And the second mechanism?
The second is the scientific explanation, which the source calls Big Bang creation. This is the stance that accepts the Big Bang theory, the idea that the universe originated from this infinitely dense, hot singularity and then expanded over billions of years.
But it views that process as the method God used.
Exactly. God is the cause, the Big Bang is the process.
So in this view, the believer isn't rejecting Genesis. They're interpreting the Genesis account of the beginning of the heavens and the earth as a theological description of God initiating the Big Bang.
Precisely. They are accepting what God created the cosmos, but they're leaving this long-duration expansion to scientific discovery.
Okay, so that's the universe. The second domain is even trickier, I think. It's the move from just matter to actual life, the origin of life. This is the leap from non-living matter to the very first self-replicating cell.
Right, a huge leap. And again, we have the 2 parallel mechanisms. The traditional one is temporary supernatural creation. Life just appeared suddenly, fully formed, specifically on the 3rd or 5th day of creation week, requiring this direct, instant, supernatural intervention from God.
And the scientific alternative?
The scientific mechanism is what the source calls abiogenesis creation. This position accepts the scientific possibility that life arose from non-life through natural chemical processes over a very long time.
And it views this process, abiogenesis, as the precise method that was established and sustained by God for life to emerge.
That's the idea. Now, abiogenesis is maybe the most scientifically challenging of the three domains. Science hasn't fully replicated this process yet. But the theological point remains exactly the same.
Which is?
If God is the creator, he could have built the laws of physics and chemistry in such a way that life was, well, inevitable, that it was an inherent potential within the material world he set up. This requires you to view the process itself as divinely enabled.
Okay, and finally, the third domain. This is the one that causes the most immediate conflict, and it's the one that most people just call evolution. It's the development of existing life and the origin of species.
Right. And the first mechanism is, again, temporary supernatural creation. This view holds that all species appeared in their current form, or at least in their basic kind, instantly or within that initial creative week. No need for any large-scale diversification process after that.
And the second mechanism, the scientific one.
That is evolutionary creation. This view accepts the biological theory of evolution, natural selection, common descent, diversification over deep time, as the process, the mechanism that God used to develop and diversify all the life we see today.
It's really essential to notice how the sources are labeling these scientific models. It's not just Big Bang, it's Big Bang creation. Not just evolution, but evolutionary creation.
Yes, that's a critical point. The word creation is always retained because, within this entire framework, accepting the scientific mechanism never means you yield the belief in the ultimate intelligent agent behind it all.
That is the critical maneuver here. By placing these scientific models under the banner of creation, the believer is basically freed up to engage with science without feeling like they're compromising their core belief.
Indeed. And the key insight here is that God is utterly sovereign over his own means of operation. He isn't restricted to only operating outside the laws he established.
So he can do miracles, but he doesn't have to.
Of course. He can perform direct supernatural intervention. That's what the six-day model posits.
Yeah.
But he can also work perfectly through the natural laws and processes that he himself established at the beginning of time.
So if God established natural laws that were so robust and intricate that they could lead over billions of years from a single point to complex human life, I mean, that demonstrates an even greater, more sustained kind of providence than a simple, instantaneous creation.
It really does. It shifts the focus from a God who needs to constantly step in and intervene to a God who is an all-wise architect, one who designed a self-sustaining, dynamic, and developing system.
So all of these positions are on the table for a believer.
All of them. Whether you accept none of the scientific mechanisms or all three, they are all acceptable for a believer, provided you hold firm to that ultimate truth of the Creator.
And this realization that the mechanism is negotiable while the agency is not, it leads to a really powerful conclusion about our faith communities.
It does. The source material argues that these debates about mechanism are fundamentally non-essential to the core doctrine of Christianity.
They shouldn't be a reason for division.
They absolutely shouldn't. They should not be a cause of conflict or emotional distress or any kind of division among believers. Quarreling over God's preferred construction methodology, whether he used instantaneous fiat or sustained natural law, it just distracts from the peace and unity that believers are called to maintain around the essentials of the faith.
The essentials being?
The nature of God, the reality of sin, the absolute necessity of redemption.
Now we arrive at the unavoidable hurdle here, Genesis. Because for many people, accepting a long-duration mechanism like evolutionary creation, it just feels like a betrayal of Scripture. Because Genesis seems to explicitly describe the method, creation over 6 literal days. If you read that description strictly, it basically locks you into that supernatural temporary model for all 3 of the domains we just analyzed.
This is where we really need to apply the same critical thinking skills we use on the rest of Scripture. The challenge is moving away from a strict literalism in Genesis 1 and 2, and for that, you need a robust theological and literary counterargument. We have to ask, what was the original purpose and genre of this text?
Okay, so let's delve into that. The literary genre of Genesis, particularly chapters 1 through 11, what are scholars saying about how this text was actually intended to be read by its original audience?
Well, many theological sources suggest that Genesis 1 through 11 contains strong elements of poetic emphasis. It uses dramatic structure and figurative expression to convey these really profound theological truths.
So it's not a science textbook from the 21st century.
To read it that way is to completely ignore the nature of ancient Near Eastern literature. That kind of literature often used narrative frameworks to establish cosmology and divine authority, not to record precise scientific mechanisms.
So the goal wasn't necessarily to tell us how God did it, scientifically speaking, but to tell us that God did it and maybe why it matters for humanity.
Exactly. The critical question we have to ask ourselves is this. Does Genesis prioritize the duration, the specific 6 days, or does it prioritize the agent and the result, the God-created outcome?
And the source material argues for the latter.
It argues forcefully for the latter. The profound truth that Genesis emphasizes is not the clock, it's the fact that the sovereign God brought order out of pre-existing chaos, or out of non-existence. The structure itself, light, then darkness, water, then land. It's a progression that establishes God's rulership over every single aspect of existence.
This changes the importance of the keywords then. If the narrative's purpose is to establish God as the sovereign creator, then the specific timing, the 6 days, it's essentially a literary device, a narrative device.
It's a device to establish a pattern of work and rest, which then links creation to the eventual institution of the Sabbath for the nation of Israel. Therefore, the 6 days keyword isn't essential to the core truth being communicated.
The argument is that the passage serves to establish theological truth and a historical relationship between God and humanity, not scientific detail.
That's the argument, and here's where the source provides a really fascinating nuance. Reading Genesis figuratively does not mean it is not factual.
Now, that is a hard concept for a lot of people to grasp. We tend to conflate literal with true. How can a figurative description still be factually accurate?
Well, try to consider the description from the perspective of a transcendent God who operates outside of our linear human time.
Okay.
From God's timeless viewpoint, the description in Genesis remained perfectly accurate, regardless of the mechanism or the duration. There is light and darkness, there are creatures existing after their kind, there are seas and dry land.
So whether those things appeared instantly or they developed over eons through a sustained natural law, the ultimate reality that the Genesis narrative describes is still accurate.
Exactly. The figurative language, or the poetic framing, it captures the truth of the event without being a slave to the precise timeline of the mechanism.
To make this interpretive leap feel safer for the believer, I think we need to show that this practice using figurative language for essential truth is already foundational to Christianity itself.
Yes.
And the source material uses some really powerful biblical precedents, specifically from the doctrine of redemption.
This is absolutely crucial. If we accept metaphor and typology for the most sacred and historically witnessed events of our faith, we have to logically extend that same interpretive flexibility to the prehistorical narratives.
Okay, give us an example.
Take, for instance, the very first prophecy in the Bible, the woman's offspring bruising the serpent's head in Genesis 3:15. That is highly symbolic, highly prophetic language. Nobody thinks a literal person is going to step on a snake's head to save humanity.
Right. Or you can look at the entire sacrificial system. The Passover lamb in Exodus 12 is explicitly accepted by Christians as symbolic, a type of Christ.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
We accept that salvation comes through the substitutionary blood of Christ, but we don't believe Christ was a literal four-legged animal. The symbol conveys the essential truth of substitutionary sacrifice.
There's another profound example, the bronze serpent in the book of Numbers.
Yes, in Numbers 21. When the Israelites were dying from snake bites, they were saved by looking at a bronze image of a serpent on a pole. Jesus himself references this as a direct type that foreshadows the cross. It symbolizes life coming from accepting a cursed object.
And the sign of Christ's resurrection, which is so central to our faith, is symbolized by Jonah's 3 days and nights in the belly of the great fish. We don't believe the resurrection literally happened inside a large marine creature.
Right, but we accept the symbolism of the 3 days.
And finally, Paul explicitly interprets the historical event of striking the rock for water in the wilderness from Exodus, and he does this in 1 Corinthians.
Yes, in 1 Corinthians 10:4, he states that the rock was Christ. The literal historical event serves as a deep symbolic truth pointing toward the Redeemer.
So the logic follows this path. Nobody interprets Jesus literally as a serpent-crushing warrior or a literal lamb or a bronze snake. Since we readily accept figurative language for the redemption narrative, which humanity actually witnessed historically and documented, why on earth should we insist on strict, non-negotiable literalism for the creation and fall narratives?
Which occurred before recorded human history and before any historical witness.
Exactly.
The refusal to apply a consistent literary analysis seems to imply a kind of theological insecurity,
Right.
It suggests that the truth of creation is somehow less robust than the truth of redemption. But God, the author, uses consistent methods of communication throughout his word.
And this focus on the essence over the literal detail, it really mirrors Jesus' own teaching method. He was constantly pushing people beyond the letter of the law to the heart and the intention behind it.
Absolutely. When he was healing on the Sabbath, Jesus wasn't rejecting the law. He was demonstrating that life and mercy were the purpose of the Sabbath. He was prioritizing the essence over the restrictive rule.
He did the same thing with the Ten Commandments.
He took the literal commandments and expanded them to include the motivation of the heart. He showed that sin isn't just an external action, but an internal intent. He was always teaching us to look deeper.
So the ultimate question for you, the learner, has to be this. Is the absolute, essential truth of creation the 6 days, or is it the existence of the Creator God who established order and purpose?
The sources compellingly argue that clinging to the literalism of the 6 days unnecessarily generates conflict and, frankly, distracts from the profound essential truth of God's sovereign agency.
It's necessary now that we acknowledge that this move towards evolutionary creation, this idea of viewing the Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution as God's mechanisms, it creates some serious theological friction points for a lot of people.
Yes, these are not minor concerns.
No, they're not. They involve foundational doctrines of the faith. So we have to provide a really detailed analysis for the 3 major challenges that come up. Let's start with the first one, which is this kind of literalism trap, the comparison between creation and the resurrection.
Right. This is the first and maybe the most frequent challenge that's raised against any non-literal reading of Genesis. It's the slippery slope argument.
Lay it out for us.
The critique goes something like this. If you allow the creation account to be merely metaphorical or figurative, how can you then turn around and demand that the resurrection of Jesus Christ be taken as a literal historical fact? Doesn't the entire foundation of Christianity just crumble if we start picking and choosing what's history and what's poetry?
And that's a powerful critique. Because for the average believer, both creation and the resurrection feel like these equally fundamental miracles. So how does the source material draw a firm distinction between them?
The distinction is rooted in the concepts of prehistorical narrative versus historical testimony. The source material stresses the historical distinctiveness and verification of Jesus Christ's resurrection.
What does that mean, historical distinctiveness?
It means the resurrection is not part of some foundational cosmological narrative that precedes human history. It's part of the story of salvation, an event that happened within human time and space.
Okay, so elaborate on that. Why does the historical context of the resurrection make it so different from the creation account?
Because the resurrection was clearly confirmed by numerous human witnesses, it was a public event, it was documented in multiple independent accounts, and it fundamentally changed the trajectory of human history. It formed the foundation upon which the entire Christian faith was built.
So it's the historical verification, the empirical documentation, and the testimony that distinguishes it.
It's what distinguishes it from the creation narrative, which, by its very definition, precedes recorded history and any human witness.
So, to sum it up, creation is a foundational, non-witnessed event that details the origin of matter, time, and life itself.
Right, it's a foundational cosmology.
Whereas the resurrection is a specific witnessed event that validates the identity of the Redeemer and inaugurates the new covenant. So we're dealing with 2 totally different categories of truth claims.
That is the essential difference. We can apply a figurative interpretation to a foundational cosmological narrative without in any way undermining the historical fact of an event that was verified within history. The historical verification of the resurrection sets it apart and makes it immune to that criticism.
Okay, let's move to the second challenge. This one is profoundly difficult, especially for those holding a traditional view of the fall.
Yes, the problem of death before sin.
Exactly. Evolution posits millions of years of life, death, disease, this relentless cycle of survival of the fittest, all happening before the emergence of humanity. That means death existed before Adam's sin.
Which seems to contradict Genesis.
It does. If God is perfect and called creation good, how could this brutal, endless cycle of suffering and death exist? Doesn't Genesis imply that there was a perfect, deathless world before the fall?
This challenge, it forces us into a very deep re-examination of the biblical definition of death. The traditional view equates biological death, the cessation of life, with the spiritual consequence of sin.
But the source material argues that's not quite right.
It argues that biblical death, as it relates to the consequence of the fall, may not equate strictly to literal biological mortality across the entire natural world.
So if it's not biological death, then what is the fundamental biblical definition of death?
It is fundamentally separation from God, who is the source of all spiritual life. Think about it. The statement in Genesis 2:17, "In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die," it didn't result in Adam instantly dropping dead biologically.
Right, he lived for hundreds of years after that.
Exactly. It resulted in him immediately entering a state of spiritual separation from God, which led to his expulsion from the garden. The sources define biblical death as primarily a state of being, a separation, rather than solely a specific biological event.
Wow, okay, that is a massive shift. So if biological death is just a natural consequence of a functioning cyclical ecosystem and not inherently the curse of sin, then the whole natural world's mechanism of life and death, including competition, isn't automatically deemed bad.
Exactly. We have to consider the purpose of these natural cycles. Is biological death always evil? We can even look to Jesus' own words in the New Testament to frame this.
Which ones?
Unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many crops. Biological death in that sense can be a necessary mechanism for renewal, for growth, for the thriving of the entire ecosystem.
So the sources are suggesting that the cyclical nature of life and death is perhaps an expression of God's sustained providence, a way to manage resources, ensure diversity, and enable renewal, even if it looks violent from our limited perspective.
Yes. Our assessment that the natural world, the survival of the fittest dynamic, is inherently bad.
Hmm.
Well, that might in fact be a reflection of human judgment and interpretation, one that's rooted in our post-fall experience of mortality and grief.
We struggle with death because we now experience spiritual separation.
We do. But from God's timeless perspective, before the fall, the biological mechanism of life and death may have simply been a necessary operational rule for a system that was designed for ongoing change and development.
The pre-fall world was called good. So if the mechanisms of evolution and natural turnover existed then, they must have existed in a way that God assessed as beneficial or good for the overall cosmic process.
We have to be really cautious about imposing our limited perspective, which is shaped by the curse and mortality, onto the eons of natural history. The focus shifts from arguing about the existence of biological death to affirming that the spiritual separation, the state of death, was the true consequence of Adam's sin.
Okay, that brings us to the final and maybe the most foundational challenge of all. This one deals with the historical Adam, the doctrine of original sin, and really the entire framework of redemption.
This is the big one.
It is. Romans chapter 5 is explicit. Just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, so death came to all men. If evolution implies Adam wasn't a single historical person who sinned, doesn't that just dismantle the entire doctrine of original sin, and by extension, the need for Jesus, the new Adam?
This challenge goes right to the theological hinge of the entire Christian narrative. If the first Adam is just a metaphor, does the second Adam, Jesus, lose his historical efficacy?
That is the core fear, and it's a legitimate one. So how do theologians who accept evolution reconcile this tension we see in Romans 5?
Well, first, it's really important to stress that there is significant theological variety on this. Many established theological positions, even those that accept evolution, still affirm Adam's historicity.
How do they do that?
They hold him as a single, first human being who was created uniquely by God at a specific moment in time. They might argue that evolution shaped all of creation up to a certain point, but then God intervened to make Adam a unique spiritual being. The two ideas are not mutually exclusive.
Okay, but what if someone does question Adam's individual historicity? What if they view him as a representative figure or maybe a seminal group of early humans that first gained self-awareness and spiritual responsibility? Can the doctrine of the fall still hold up?
The sources affirm that it can, because the core Christian belief is the fact of humanity's fall, the entry of sin into the historical reality of mankind, resulting in this state of separation from God. The ultimate truth is that every person born into the world is born into a condition of sin and requires grace.
So the mechanism of how sin entered, whether it was through a single individual's act or through the disobedience of a representative group, that's secondary to the result.
Secondary to the result, which is the undeniable universality of the sin condition.
That's the key.
Exactly. The source suggests we should focus on the consequence rather than getting lost in the descriptive details of the mechanism. The mechanism of the fall, the nature of the temptation, whether it involves symbolic language or if Adam was one person or a representative, It doesn't affect the ultimate central fact that we are all sinners in need of grace.
So Romans 5 still applies because we all belong to the reality that was ushered in by the fall. We are all fallen, therefore we all need the new Adam.
Precisely.
This keeps returning to the recurring theme of this entire deep dive. Believing that creation only happens suddenly or instantly, or only through spectacular supernatural means, it unduly restricts the Creator's operational freedom.
It's us putting God in a box. We are limiting the infinite wisdom of God. God works constantly, often through quiet, sustained, natural processes. He can certainly work in mysterious, clearly miraculous ways. We affirm that, absolutely. But we should never demand that God restrict his methods to only the instantly spectacular.
In fact, you could argue that the consistent, sustained working of God through eons of established laws, from the Big Bang to the development of species, is arguably more awe-inspiring.
I would agree. It demonstrates an intelligence vast enough to undergird all of existence without needing constant ad hoc intervention.
It reveals a level of sustained providence and meticulous design that goes far beyond what we might imagine if we limit him only to a sudden, instantaneous creation.
And this perspective, it's what allows faith and robust scientific inquiry to coexist. It allows us to celebrate the God who establishes the rule and also the God who, when necessary, intervenes beyond the rule.
So this deep dive has really brought us full circle. We started by identifying that fundamental error in pitting creation against evolution. And what we've seen is that regardless of the scientific validity of any specific model, Big Bang, abiogenesis, or evolution, the foundational theological truth remains the same.
That we are all sinners, we are all fallen.
And we all require the grace of Jesus Christ, the new Adam.
We have established that the mechanism of creation, the how, is fundamentally non-essential to the core tenets of the Christian faith. The identity of the Creator, the who, and the necessity of redemption are the essential, non-negotiable truths upon which we have to stand.
And to leave you with a final provocative thought, one that builds on the source material's powerful argument about God working through natural laws. The entire premise today was that limiting creation to only supernatural intervention unduly restricts God's method of operation.
So, if God's wisdom is vast enough to design and sustain the entire cosmos through billions of years of consistent, evolving natural processes, the Big Bang and evolution, then consider how we might be unknowingly limiting God's work in our own lives or in the wider world today.
What do you mean?
Are we demanding only the dramatic, the visible miracle, the instant supernatural intervention? And in doing so, are we thereby missing the quiet, persistent, and powerful work He is doing right now through the natural laws, the persistent providence, and the sustainable systems He has already established all around us?
A profound challenge to our expectations of the divine. We hope this deep dive into the source material has given you the theological framework necessary to hold fast to the Creator while engaging deeply and meaningfully with the fascinating revelations of modern science. Thanks for joining us.